The wind howled low across the plains that morning, dragging dust like old ghosts through the narrow main street of Ashton's Hollow. A man in a long coat stepped off his horse and into the silence. Folks turned away. Mothers called children in. One storekeeper fumbled his lock and shuttered early. Clint Boone didn't ask questions, he never did. He tied his mare outside the saloon, lit a match on his belt buckle, and stared at the flame too long before lighting his smoke. Behind him, under the wooden awning of the mercantile, a child sat, knees drawn up, face blotched red from crying. She couldn't have been more than 5. Her dress was damp, muddy at the hem, and one boot was missing. A crude tag had been pinned to her collar. It said only, "Her name is Ruth. She's all I had." Clint turned, slow. One hand brushed his coat aside, the motion enough to show the butt of a revolver. The child flinched but didn't run. He squatted before her, smoke curling upward like fog on a cold river. "Who left you here, little one?" he asked, his voice the sound of gravel under saddle. She didn't speak, just stared back, the way animals do after being chased too far. From the hotel porch, a man in a brown vest scoffed. "That girl's been sitting there near half the night. Ain't nobody claiming her. Sheriff says he ain't got time for orphans." Clint stood up. The cigarette burned down between his fingers. He didn't say a word, didn't look at anyone, just turned back toward his mare and walked. He was almost to the saddle when he heard it, soft footsteps behind him, hesitant. He turned slow. Ruth stood there, arms at her side, hair in tangled ropes. Her lip quivered, but she looked him dead in the eye. It wasn't fear, not really, it was hope, hanging by a thread. He looked down, then reached for the saddlebag, pulled out a wool blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. Lifted her up like he'd done it before, though he hadn't. Sat her in front of the saddle. The townsfolk didn't speak, didn't interfere. Clint Boone, the feared bounty hunter who once left 3 men dead outside Elkhorn Station, was riding out with a child who didn't belong to him. No one saw him look back, but he did. And for the first time in years, his heart hurt. The sun was setting behind the hills when Clint reached the edge of his land, a crooked stretch of dry pasture where the wind always seemed to whistle just a little colder. The ranch house was small, its paint long swallowed by dust and time. A crooked fence leaned away from the wind, as if trying to escape the land it failed to guard. He hadn't brought anyone here since the war. Ruth had fallen asleep somewhere between town and the ridge. Her head rested against his chest, fingers still clutching the edge of the blanket. He dismounted slowly, careful not to wake her, but her eyes opened just as his boots touched the ground. "Where are we?" she asked, voice barely louder than breath. "My place," Clint said. "Ain't much." She nodded like that meant something, like the absence of grandeur was a kind of safety. He lifted her down, set her feet gently on the porch. She wobbled slightly, and he steadied her with one hand. Inside, the air smelled of ash and pine. A fire hadn't been lit in days. Dust hung in the light like old memories. Clint moved with silent precision, lit a lamp, struck a flame in the hearth, filled a tin kettle without speaking. Ruth stood in the doorway, not moving, watching. "You hungry?" he asked. She nodded. He pulled a pot from the shelf, began chopping what was left of a potato, a carrot gone soft. Meat would come tomorrow, maybe. For now, soup would have to do. She didn't speak again until he set the bowl in front of her, steam rising in slow ribbons. "You live here alone?" she asked. He paused, eyes fixed on the fire. "Yes." She didn't push further, just sipped the soup, tiny hands holding the tin bowl like it might vanish if she blinked. When she finished, she set it down and stared into the flames. "My mama used to hum at night," she said. "Said it kept the bad dreams from finding us." Clint didn't answer. His own dreams had teeth, and no humming had ever tamed them. He brought out a spare quilt, the one he hadn't touched since Sarah passed. She'd made it by hand, each stitch neat and stubborn. He laid it on the small cot by the hearth and motioned for Ruth to lie down. She obeyed, curling into herself like a pup caught in the cold. He sat nearby, not close, just enough to keep watch. After a long silence, her voice came soft again. "Are you going to leave me too?" The question didn't belong in a child's mouth. It was too heavy, too old. Clint stared into the fire for a long time before answering. His voice was rough. "No, Ruth, I ain't going to leave." She closed her eyes then, as if the words were enough. But Clint remained still. hands folded in his lap, the fire warming only the outside of his skin. That night, the wind rose again. It rattled the windows and whistled through the boards. Clint sat in the rocker, rifle leaning beside him, eyes open. He didn't sleep, not because he couldn't, because she did, and he intended to keep it that way. Mornings on the ridge came slow, like a man recovering from a long night of sorrow. Fog clung to the fields like regret, thick and unmoving, and the world outside seemed quieter than it had any right to be. Clint stood at the edge of the porch, one hand resting on the rail, the other holding a coffee tin that had cooled hours before. Behind him, Ruth stirred beneath the quilt. Her breathing had softened sometime near dawn, steady and deep, like she finally believed she could rest. He watched the hills for movement. There wasn't any, just crows drifting low and the far-off bark of a dog he didn't own. The kind of sounds that didn't mean much, unless you were the kind of man who needed silence to survive. She came to the door barefoot, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her small frame dwarfed by the stitched quilt she wore like armor. "Is this where the cows live?" she asked. Clint gave a slow nod. "If we had any." She smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was something to say. Children did that sometimes when they weren't sure if the world still had room for joy. They fed the chickens, or what few remained after the last dry season. Ruth scattered corn like she'd been doing it her whole life. Clint handed her a tin bucket, filled it at the pump, and watched as she watered the dusty trough without complaint. Later, she found an old doll half buried in the loft. Sarah's, maybe, or something left behind by a guest long gone. The face was faded, one button eye missing, the dress torn. Ruth hugged it like it mattered anyway. That night, after the stew and the quiet, Clint sat on the porch again. Ruth sat beside him, her legs swinging above the steps. They didn't speak much, but sometimes he looked at her and saw something terrifying. A future. He'd buried that word a long time ago, out by the oak tree where Sarah's cross stood, weathered and grey. The earth there had never fully settled. It rose slightly in the middle, like her body might still be breathing beneath. Ruth asked about it on the third night. "Who's buried under that tree?" "My wife," Clint said, his voice low. She didn't pry, just nodded like death was a thing she already understood. "You talk to her sometimes?" she asked. Clint exhaled through his nose. "Sometimes." "What do you say?" He took a long time to answer. "Mostly nothing. Just let her know I still miss the sound of her hands." Ruth looked at him, the way only a child could, without pity, without agenda, just full of questions she didn't yet know how to ask. Clint stood and walked toward the barn. She followed, holding the quilt tight around her. Inside, dust motes floated in the lantern light. The stall smelled of old hay and the salt of leather. He showed her the saddle he hadn't used in years, the bridle Sarah had cleaned every winter. Ruth ran her fingers over the worn straps. "She'd have liked you," Clint said. "You think so?" She had a soft spot for folks with sad eyes. Ruth didn't smile, but her mouth tilted, just a little. That night, when the fire burned low and Clint thought she'd fallen asleep, she whispered one more question into the dark. "If I stay, do I gotta forget my mama?" The words stabbed like a knife left in the cold. Clint walked over, knelt beside her cot, and rested one hand over the quilt. "No," he said. "You remember her every day. You remember the way she smelled, the way she sang, even the way she yelled when you ran too far." He paused, his voice catching in his throat. "Just make room in your heart, that's all. You don't have to erase anyone to love somebody new." She reached out and touched his hand. Didn't say anything. Didn't have to. Outside, the wind had softened, and for the first time in years, Clint Boone didn't feel alone in the sound of it. A week passed in hush and dust. The ranch began to breathe again, quiet but steady, like old wood swelling after rain. Clint noticed things he hadn't before, the way Ruth lined up pebbles on the fence rail, how she always left one slice of cornbread untouched, saving it like a ritual. She still spoke little, but her silences had softened. They no longer felt like wounds. They felt like roots growing deeper. Each morning he found her out by the pasture, staring at the horizon as if waiting for something, or someone. He didn't ask who. He figured some ghosts belonged to children too. He started mending the barn, Not because it needed it, but because it gave his hands something to do. Ruth would sit nearby, tying scraps of twine around nails, pretending they were horses or traps or angels. Sometimes she sang to herself, soft, tuneless, but enough to make Clint pause mid-hammer and close his eyes. One night, as they were finishing supper, she said something unexpected. "I don't like the way people look at me." Clint didn't look up. He kept spooning beans into his mouth, slow. "They look like I don't belong," she said, "like I'm a mistake." He wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "Town's full of folks who don't know how to see. You ever feel like that?" He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. Looked at her, really looked. Her face held too much for someone that small. He saw bruises there that weren't purple anymore, just memories now. "I used to," he said, "long time ago." "Why?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he got up, took a small tin box from the shelf. Inside it was a photo, cracked, edges curled. A younger Clint, in uniform. Sarah beside him. Between them, a boy. "This was Eli," Clint said. Ruth's eyes narrowed. "Your son?" Clint nodded. He didn't make it past 7. Fever took him before we could get him to a doctor. He handed her the photo, let her hold it. Her hands trembled slightly. "I was out hunting that day," he said. "Didn't make it back in time." The silence that followed was not hollow. It was full, heavy, sacred. "You miss him?" "Every damn day." That night, Ruth sat a little closer to him by the fire. Her shoulder touched his for a heartbeat before she leaned away. But that heartbeat stayed with him. The next day, the first real storm in months rolled in. The clouds came in low and black, the kind that bent trees and made horses restless. Clint gathered firewood while Ruth stayed inside, trying to keep the windows from rattling loose. He lit the lamps early, checked the rifle, and bolted the door. They ate cold biscuits and apples while the sky cracked open. Then came a knock. Not a timid one. 3 hard strikes. Clint stood slowly, looked at Ruth, then at the door. He didn't speak, just moved to the window, rifle in hand. Outside stood a man with a red kerchief around his neck, soaked from the rain. Behind him, 2 more horses tethered to the fence post. Clint didn't open the door. "Boone," the man outside called, "heard you took in a girl. That true?" Ruth stiffened. Her eyes widened, body frozen like prey that senses the predator. Clint's jaw clenched. He stepped forward just enough so his shadow would be seen through the curtain. "What business is it of yours?" The man outside smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "That girl's got kin looking. Man down in Wexler says she ran off. Claims she's his." Clint opened the door just wide enough to show his face and the rifle barrel. "She didn't run. She was left." "She's property, Boone," the man said. "Ain't yours to keep." Clint's voice dropped low. "She ain't property, and she ain't going with you." Behind him, Ruth pressed her back to the wall, eyes wide, the old doll clutched to her chest. The man outside adjusted his stance, hand inching toward his sidearm. "This don't concern you, Boone. Hand her over. Be smart." Clint didn't flinch. "You come back with the sheriff or you don't come back at all." The standoff held for a breath too long. Then the man spat in the dirt, turned to mount his horse. "You made your choice. We'll see how long it stands." The 3 men rode off into the dark. Clint shut the door and bolted it again. Turned to Ruth. She hadn't moved. He knelt beside her, touched her shoulder. "You're safe here," he said, "but they'll come back. Let 'em." Outside, the rain fell harder. But inside, Clint Boone's fire burned hot. And for the first time in years, it had a purpose. The storm didn't pass that night. It lingered, stubborn and mean, scratching at the windows like it had something to prove. Thunder rolled across the plains, not sharp but heavy like distant cannons. Ruth curled beneath the quilt on the cot, her eyes open, unblinking. Clint sat by the door with his rifle across his lap, staring into the dark. He didn't sleep, not because of the men. Not even because of the girl. He didn't sleep because something inside him had begun to shift, a thing he thought long buried. The part of him that once believed he might be more than a weapon, that he might be needed. By morning, the sky had cleared, but the silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was expectant, like the earth itself held its breath. Clint saddled his mare before sunrise. Ruth stood barefoot on the porch, watching. "Where are you going?" she asked. He pulled the strap tight. "Into town, need to speak with someone." She stepped down, holding the edge of her dress. "What if they come back while you're gone?" Clint kneeled so they were eye to eye. "You stay inside. Lock the door. Don't open it unless you hear me call." She nodded, but her hands trembled. He placed a small revolver in the crate near the hearth before leaving. She stared at it like it was made of fire. Clint rode hard toward Ashton's Hollow. The road felt longer this time, lined with ghosts he hadn't felt in years. Every mile brought back a face, a name, a voice long gone. Men he'd hunted, women he'd buried. His own reflection from days when he thought survival was enough. When he reached the sheriff's office, he didn't dismount. Sheriff Deeks was sweeping the porch, pipe hanging loose from his lip. "Boone," he said, eyeing him warily. "Heard there's trouble brewing." Clint nodded. "3 men came to my place last night. Said they were looking for the girl." Deeks squinted. "The orphan. She was abandoned, not claimed, and not for sale." The sheriff sighed, leaned on the broom. "That's a hard thing to prove out here, Clint. Folks don't take kindly to others meddling with kin. She was bruised, cold, and left in the street with a note. You want to pretend that's kin, be my guest. But they come back and I won't be asking twice." Deeks didn't speak for a while. Then he nodded toward the telegraph shack. "I'll send word to Wexler, see if there's any truth to their claim. Meanwhile, you do what you need to do." Clint tipped his hat, turned the mare and rode back. But something gnawed at him the whole way home, something he hadn't let himself feel since Sarah's funeral. Dread. When he reached the ridge, the house looked unchanged. Still. Too still. He called out, "Ruth?" No answer. He dismounted fast, boots hitting dirt before the mare had stopped. The door was open. The rifle was gone from the wall. Inside, the hearth was cold, the quilt on the floor, and a trail of small, wet footprints led to the barn. He followed, heart pounding slow but deep, like a drum in the distance. When he pushed the barn door open, he found her crouched behind a bale of hay, the revolver in her lap, pointed but shaking. "It's just me," Clint said, his voice soft. She didn't lower the gun. Her breath came in sharp, short bursts. "They were here," she said. "I heard voices. I saw someone at the window." Clint knelt, one hand open, steady. "You did right," he said, "but you ain't alone anymore. You remember that." She stared at him, eyes wide with something deeper than fear. A lifetime of not being believed. He reached for the gun, slow, and she let it go. He pulled her close, arms around her small frame. She didn't resist. Outside, the sun began to rise, but in the barn, the light came slower, softer. Clint sat with her there until the warmth touched the rafters. He didn't say it out loud, but in that moment he knew. She wasn't just a child left behind, she was the beginning of something he thought he'd lost. A reason. The next 2 days passed beneath a quiet tension, like the hush before a gunshot. Clint reinforced the windows, moved his rifle closer to the door. Ruth stayed near him, her steps small and soundless, always listening. She didn't play anymore. She watched the horizon, the barn, the shadows shifting across the yard. Sometimes he caught her holding that old revolver, practicing how to point it with both hands. Her jaw clenched. She looked too young to be brave, too brave to be that young. He didn't stop her. He showed her how to hold it steady, how not to trust the sound of someone's voice over the truth in their eyes. "You don't shoot to kill," he told her. "You shoot to stop." She nodded. She understood more than she should. The telegraph came the next morning. Clint rode into town at first light. The wire from Wexler was short. Sheriff Deeks handed it over without speaking. Clint read it once, then folded it without expression. The man claiming Ruth was not her father. He was her mother's last husband, a drifter named Carl Finch, who'd worked the cattle trails for drink money and left bruises on every place he'd ever stayed. No blood tied him to the child. No papers. No claim. Just cruelty. Clint mounted up. He didn't thank the sheriff. He didn't speak at all. By the time he reached the ridge, the sun was hanging low again. He found Ruth near the tree where Sarah's cross stood. She'd placed 3 small stones at the base. Each stone had a flower tied to it with twine. "One's for my mama," she said without turning. "One's for the lady who used to live here, and one's for the boy in the picture." Clint stood there, boots buried in tall grass, chest hollowing out slow. "Do you remember her voice?" Ruth asked. "Your wife?" He swallowed hard. "I do." Ruth nodded, her eyes still on the stones. "I can't hear my mamas anymore, not even when I try." She looked up. "Can I remember someone else's voice instead?" Clint didn't answer. He walked to her, crouched down, and pulled her into his arms. "You can remember whatever you need to," he said. That night the stars came out clear, but Clint didn't sleep. He sat on the porch, rifle across his knees, eyes on the road. They came just after midnight. He heard them before he saw them. The crunch of hooves, low voices, the rhythm of men too used to hurting without consequence. 3 riders, same men as before. Only this time, they didn't knock. They rode straight to the house, dismounted slow. One carried a lantern, the others had guns drawn. Clint stood, his rifle pointed down, but ready. "You were told," he said into the dark. Carl Finch stepped forward, smirking. "And I told you. She ain't yours. She ain't yours either." "That right?" Finch took another step. "You think the world gives a damn what you think?" Clint didn't answer. He fired one shot, a warning. The lantern in Finch's hand shattered, sparks catching the edge of his coat. "Next one won't be air," Clint said. Finch didn't flinch. He took off his coat, revealing the shotgun slung over his back. His eyes glinted mean under the moonlight. Inside, Ruth crouched behind the hearth, her breath shallow. She had the revolver in her hands. Her palms were slick with sweat. Clint stepped off the porch, closing the distance. "You're not taking her," he said. "You come any closer, we'll settle this right here." Finch laughed. "You ain't law." "No," Clint said. "I'm better." A gun cocked behind Finch, one of the others. Clint didn't look away, he didn't blink. Then something strange happened. The third man, the youngest, lowered his weapon. "She's a kid," he said, voice low. "You didn't tell us she was just a kid." Finch spun, furious. "You think I care? You in or out?" The young man hesitated, then backed away. "Out," he muttered. "You're on your own." Finch's rage boiled, but it was too late. Clint took 2 steps forward and leveled the rifle. "You got 2 choices," he said. "You walk away, or I bury you right here." Finch raised his shotgun, but slow, hesitant. From the doorway a small voice called out, "Don't." Finch turned. Ruth stood in the threshold, revolver aimed steady. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she said. "You don't get to own me." Time froze. Finch looked at her, at the gun, at Clint, and then he laughed, a wild, bitter sound. "This ain't over," he said. "Men like me don't go easy." Clint stepped between them. "Then don't go easy. Just go." Finch spat in the dirt and backed away. The men rode off. No one watched them go. Clint turned to Ruth. She stood there, small but unshaking, the revolver still in her hands. He walked to her and gently took it. She didn't resist. The fire had burned low inside, but the light on her face was enough. Clint knelt, forehead to hers. "You did good," he whispered. "You were brave." And for the first time since Sarah died, Clint Boone wept. Not for what he'd lost, but for what he might still become. The morning after the standoff, the world was so quiet it felt like it had stopped breathing. Clint rose before the light and stepped outside. The wind had died. The soil still held the marks of boot heels and hooves, ghosts of the night carved into the dirt. He stared at them for a long while, as if they might still speak. Inside, Ruth slept on the cot, curled into the quilt with her arms around the old doll. A half-smile lingered on her face, as though part of her finally believed she'd woken in the right place. Clint poured coffee into a tin cup and walked to the tree where Sarah's cross stood. He sat at its base, the earth cool beneath him. "I didn't think I'd get another shot," he whispered. "Didn't think I wanted one." He looked down at his calloused hands. "She's got your kind of fire, you know. The kind that don't burn the world down, just warms what's close." He closed his eyes, let the silence settle. Later that day, Clint hitched the wagon, cleaned his hat with a dry cloth, and took Ruth into town. She wore a faded dress of Sarah's, hemmed to fit, and boots 2 sizes too big, stuffed with rags. She sat beside him on the bench, her hand in his. Didn't let go the whole way. The town was wary as always. Eyes followed. Some looked away. Others didn't bother hiding their frowns. But Clint didn't slow. He walked Ruth straight to the schoolhouse, where Miss Ada, a lean woman with silver hair and a spine like a gun barrel, stood at the door. "She's ready," Clint said, his voice firm. Miss Ada looked down at Ruth, who stared up without flinching. "What's her name?" Ada asked. "Ruth." Ada nodded. "You're late for autumn, but that don't matter. What matters is heart. She got one?" "She's all heart." Clint turned to Ruth and knelt. "I'll be just outside," he said. "Right there under the sycamore." Ruth nodded. Her hand lingered on his shoulder a second longer before she walked inside. The hours passed slow. Clint sat in the shade, carving a piece of wood with his knife. He didn't look toward the schoolhouse, not once, but his ears never stopped listening. When she came out at noon, she was smiling. It was small, uncertain, but it was real. She ran straight to him, hair wild in the wind. "We learned a song," she said, breathless, "and I read a whole sentence." Clint stood, brushed the shavings from his lap. "What did it say?" Ruth grinned. It said, "The sun is warm." Clint looked at her, something tightening in his chest. "Yes," he said. "Yes, it is." They stopped at the Mercantile on the way back. Clint bought a slate and chalk, a comb, a small tin lunchbox. Ruth picked out a blue ribbon, said it reminded her of the sky the day after rain. When they returned home, Clint placed the ribbon on the mantel beside Sarah's photo. That evening, he made a stew from the last of the root vegetables. Ruth sat at the table drawing pictures in chalk: a crooked horse, a tiny house, a woman with long braids. Clint watched her from across the room, the fire reflecting in his eyes. "You ever think about what comes next?" he asked. Ruth looked up. "Like what?" "Like stayin'. For good." She didn't answer, just walked to him, climbed into his lap, and leaned her head against his chest. "Feels like I already did." He wrapped his arms around her. The past still hung heavy. Sarah, Eli, the years lost in gunsmoke and silence. But there, in the flicker of firelight and the weight of a child's head on his shoulder, Clint Boone found something he didn't expect. Not peace, not quite, but the start of it. And that was more than he'd ever hoped for. The leaves began to change early that year. Up on the ridge, the oaks turned gold before the maples had time to blush. The morning air bit sharper, and the light fell different, softer, more forgiving. Clint woke each day before the sun, not because he had to, but because he wanted to watch the sky shift from black to blue with Ruth still asleep in the next room, her breath slow and even, like a promise the world had made to him. They settled into something that resembled a life. Ruth went to school most days, her lunch packed neatly with half a biscuit and a scribbled note Clint never let her see him write. She brought home stories about the other children, about how she taught one girl to hold a pencil and how another gave her a peach from their father's tree. Clint listened, not just with his ears, with his whole being, the way a man listens when he knows silence used to be safer. Sometimes he would find her out by the grave, whispering things he couldn't hear, and sometimes he joined her, said little, brought flowers, laid them gently. Once she asked, "Do you think Eli would have liked me?" Clint had to clear his throat before he could answer. "He would have loved you." He meant it. The winter threatened early. The wind came down from the hills and tore at the shutters, but the house was warmer than it had ever been, not from firewood but from laughter. Clint caught himself smiling more, humming sometimes, though he'd never admit it. And then, near Christmas, came a knock at the door. Not a threat this time, just a telegram. Ruth sat on the rug, feeding bits of bread to the cat that had wandered into their lives and never left. Clint read the message once, then again. His face unreadable. It was from Miss Ada. Ruth's mother, or what was left of her, had been found outside Wexler. A body in a shallow grave. A woman's shoe, torn lace, and a lock of hair still braided with twine. Clint didn't tell Ruth that night. He let her sleep. But in the morning, he rode into town and spoke with the sheriff. Paid for the coffin, made sure the body would be buried proper. He stood at the grave alone, hat in hand, the wind blowing hard enough to sting. "She gave you a life," he whispered to the wind. "I'll make sure it's a good one." When he returned, Ruth was on the porch waiting. She knew. Kids always do. Is she gone? She asked. He sat beside her. She is. Ruth didn't cry. She leaned into him, her cheek against his arm. She tried, she said. I think she really tried. Clint didn't argue. Sometimes love isn't enough, but it's still something. They lit a candle that night and left it by the window. Just in case she's looking, Ruth said. Clint watched the flame flicker against the glass. In the weeks that followed, life returned to its slow rhythm. They built a coop for spring chicks. Clint mended the well. Ruth read aloud from her primer, stumbling over words, laughing at herself. One evening, just as the sun touched the edge of the prairie, she came to him with a small book she'd made from folded paper and string. On the first page, she'd drawn a man with a wide-brimmed hat and a little girl beside him. Beneath it, she wrote in crooked letters, "My Papa Clint." He stared at it a long time. Then he took her in his arms, held her tighter than he ever had. "You sure?" he whispered. Ruth pulled back, eyes wide and clear. "I was sure the day you wrapped me in that blanket." The world tilted just a little, enough for everything to make sense. Later that night, as they sat by the fire, Ruth looked up from her drawing and asked, "Are we a family now?" Clint nodded, voice low. "We always were. Just took us a while to find each other." She leaned against him, eyelids heavy, and outside the wind didn't howl. It sang. Since that evening, the porch never echoed with silence again.